A wealthy man notices his butler wearing a pendant identical to one he gave his son before he vanished 2 decades ago. Richard sat in his big fancy study. The fire crackled softly in the fireplace, and the rain tapped against the window behind him. His desk was covered with papers, but he wasn't really paying attention to them. His mind felt heavy, like something was missing. Thomas, his butler, walked in quietly and placed a cup of tea on the desk. "Your tea, sir," Thomas said in his calm voice. Richard nodded, not even looking up. But then, something shiny caught his eye. A small pendant dangled from Thomas's neck. Richard froze. That pendant, it was the same one he had given to his son, Ethan, 20 years ago. The same Ethan who had disappeared without a trace. The pendant was silver, shaped like two vines wrapped around a bright blue stone. Richard's heart started to pound. Memories of Ethan came rushing back. His smile, the way he always wore the pendant, and the day he vanished, leaving Richard with nothing but pain and questions. Thomas noticed Richard staring and tilted his head. "Is everything all right, sir?" Richard quickly shook his head and forced a smile. "Yes, Thomas, everything is fine," he said. But inside, his mind was racing. How could Thomas have that pendant? And what did it mean? As Thomas left the room, Richard leaned back in his chair. The pendant was no ordinary piece of jewelry. It was a piece of his past, and now he needed answers. That night, Richard couldn't sleep. He lay in his enormous bed, staring at the ceiling while the rain continued outside. His mind kept returning to the pendant. He could still see it shining against Thomas's shirt, stirring memories he had buried long ago. He got up and walked to the window, watching the dark clouds swirl in the sky. Could it really be Ethan's? He whispered to himself. But how? Thomas had worked for him for years. Why hadn't he noticed the pendant before? Richard decided to dig deeper. He went to his study and opened a drawer filled with old papers. At the bottom, under stacks of forgotten documents, he found a picture of Ethan. In the photo, Ethan was smiling brightly, holding the pendant in his hand. The sight made Richard's chest tighten. The next morning, over breakfast, Richard decided to ask a casual question. Thomas was pouring coffee when Richard spoke. "That's a nice pendant you're wearing," he said lightly. Thomas paused for a moment, touching the pendant. "Oh, thank you, sir. I've had it for years." "Really? Where did you get it?" Richard asked, keeping his tone calm. Thomas hesitated, looking down at the pendant. "I found it in a pawn shop a long time ago," he said, his voice soft. Richard nodded, though his heart sank. A pawn shop? How had Ethan's pendant ended up there? And why did Thomas look so uncomfortable? As Thomas left the room, Richard sat back in his chair, his thoughts spinning. Something wasn't adding up. He needed to know more about Thomas and the pendant. Richard wasted no time. That same afternoon, he called an investigator he had worked with years ago. "I need you to look into someone," he said firmly over the phone. The investigator, Mr. Carter, asked for the details, and Richard gave him everything he knew about Thomas. The years he had worked for him, his quiet nature, and most importantly, the pendant. "It's silver, with a blue stone, and it belonged to my son," Richard explained. "He disappeared 20 years ago. I need to know where Thomas really got it." Carter agreed to start immediately. Meanwhile, Richard dug through more of his old belongings. He found another picture of Ethan, this time taken on his last birthday. In the photo, Ethan wore the pendant proudly around his neck. The memories hit Richard like waves. He remembered how Ethan loved that pendant. It was a family heirloom, passed down through generations. Losing it, and Ethan had felt like losing a part of himself. Days passed, and Richard grew more anxious. Finally, Carter called. "I found something," Carter said. "Thomas started working for you just a few months after your son disappeared." Richard's grip on the phone tightened. "What else?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. "There's a record of him selling some belongings at a pawn shop around the same time. It matches the area where your son was last seen," Carter continued. Richard's heart raced. Could Thomas have known something about Ethan all along? He thanked Carter and hung up, his mind spinning with possibilities. That evening, Richard sat alone in his study, staring at the pendant in his memories, and the man wearing it now. The questions wouldn't stop. Who was Thomas really, and how was he connected to Ethan's disappearance? The next evening, Richard couldn't keep his thoughts to himself any longer. As Thomas cleared the dinner table, Richard broke the silence. "Thomas," he began, his voice steady but firm, "I need to ask you something important." Thomas paused, placing the last dish on the tray. "Of course, sir. What is it?" Richard gestured for him to sit, which Thomas did, though his expression grew cautious. Richard leaned forward, his hands clasped tightly. "That pendant you wear, it belonged to my son, Ethan. He disappeared 20 years ago." Thomas's eyes widened, and his hand instinctively went to the pendant. "I didn't know," he said quietly. "Then tell me," Richard pressed. "How did you come to own it?" Thomas hesitated, his gaze dropping to the table. "I told you, sir. I found it in a pawn shop years ago. I didn't know it had any connection to you or your family." "Which pawn shop?" Richard asked sharply. Thomas frowned, clearly uncomfortable. "It was a small shop in the city, near the old train station. I don't remember much more. It was such a long time ago. Richard studied Thomas's face. He didn't appear to be lying, but there was a shadow of unease in his voice. Was it guilt or something else? Thomas, Richard said, his tone softer now, if there's anything you're not telling me, I need to know. This isn't just a piece of jewelry, it's a part of my son's life, and I've been searching for answers for 20 years. Thomas nodded slowly. I understand, sir. I'll try to remember more. As Thomas left the room, Richard felt torn. The conversation had only deepened the mystery. Something about Thomas's hesitation didn't feel right, and Richard couldn't shake the feeling that there was more to the story. The following morning, Richard called Mr. Carter again. I need you to track down the pawn shop near the old train station. Thomas claims he bought the pendant there, he explained. Carter promised to investigate immediately, and Richard was left to wait once more. The hours dragged on as he wandered through his sprawling home, memories of Ethan clouding his thoughts. Each corner seemed to echo with faint reminders of his son, his laughter, his footsteps, and the warmth he brought to the house. By evening, Carter called back. His voice was serious. I found the shop. It closed down years ago, but I tracked the former owner. What did he say? Richard asked, gripping the phone tightly. The owner remembers the pendant. He said a young man brought it in, looking desperate. The description he gave, it matches your son, Ethan. Richard's breath caught. Are you sure? As sure as I can be, Carter replied. But there's more. The man claimed the boy seemed confused, maybe scared. He said he was running from something, or someone. The words hit Richard like a punch to the gut. What could Ethan have been running from? And why had he sold the pendant, something he cherished so much? Thank you, Carter, Richard said, his voice heavy. I'll handle the rest from here. That night, Richard sat in his study, piecing together everything he had learned. Ethan had been alive, frightened, and alone. The pendant had somehow ended up with Thomas, a man who had worked under Richard's roof for nearly 20 years. The connections felt too close to be coincidence. Richard realized he needed to confront the truth, no matter how painful. His next conversation with Thomas wouldn't be a question. It would be a demand. The next evening, Richard called Thomas into the study. The air was heavy with tension as Thomas stepped inside, his usual calm demeanor replaced by a subtle unease. Thomas, Richard began, his voice steady but colder than usual. We need to talk. No more half answers. No more excuses. I know where the pendant came from. Thomas froze, his hand instinctively moving to the pendant. Sir, the owner of the pawn shop remembered it, Richard interrupted, standing up. He said a young man sold it to him, a man who matched Ethan's description, my son. Thomas's face paled, and he took a step back. Sir, I didn't know. Didn't you? Richard's voice rose slightly, his frustration finally surfacing. You came to work for me right after Ethan disappeared. You've worn that pendant for years, and you never thought to mention it? Thomas lowered his head, his voice barely above a whisper. I didn't think it mattered at first. At first? Richard pressed, his eyes narrowing. What do you mean? Thomas hesitated, then sighed deeply. I remember the boy who sold it. He was young, thin, and looked lost. But I didn't know it was your son. Not until I saw the photo of him in the hallway years later. By then, I didn't know what to do. Richard's chest tightened. Why didn't you tell me? Why keep this from me all these years? I was afraid, Thomas admitted, his voice trembling. Afraid of what you'd think. Afraid of opening old wounds. And I didn't know where the boy went after that day. I swear. Richard sank back into his chair, overwhelmed by a mix of anger, grief, and confusion. You could have given me a clue, Thomas. You could have helped me find him. Thomas nodded, guilt etched on his face. I'm sorry, sir. Truly. If I'd known it would lead to this, I would have spoken sooner. The room fell silent, both men lost in their thoughts. For Richard, the truth was devastating, but it wasn't enough. He still didn't know where Ethan was or why he had vanished. And now he had one more question to answer. Where had his son gone after selling the pendant? The next morning, Richard couldn't shake the feeling that he was on the edge of something big. Thomas's confession had given him a glimpse into the past, but there were still too many unanswered questions. Why had Ethan disappeared? Where had he gone after selling the pendant? Determined to uncover the truth, Richard visited the old pawn shop that Carter had mentioned. The building was small, its windows dusty and cracked. The sign above the door was faded, the paint peeling off. As Richard entered, the musty smell of old books and forgotten things filled the air. Inside, he found a man sorting through old items behind a cluttered counter. Richard approached him slowly. Excuse me, I'm looking for information about a young man who sold a pendant here 20 years ago. Do you remember anything about him? The man squinted up at Richard. A pendant, huh? Could be. That shop saw a lot of people back then, but I remember one kid who came in, looking like he had the weight of the world on his shoulders. Richard's heart skipped a beat. Was it Ethan? Did he say anything? The shopkeeper rubbed his chin, trying to recall. The kid was in bad shape, thin, eyes wide like he was running from something. He didn't say much, but he seemed desperate. Left in a hurry, too. Almost like he was being chased. Richard's mind raced. Ethan had been running from someone, or something. But who, and why? Do you know where he went after? Richard asked urgently. The shopkeeper shrugged. Can't say for sure, but I remember him mentioning a place, a hospital. It was just outside town. He looked like he needed help. Richard's heart pounded. A hospital. It was a lead, a place where Ethan might have gone for safety. Without wasting another second, he thanked the shopkeeper and rushed out of the pawn shop. The hospital was only a short drive away, a place Richard hadn't visited in years. As he pulled into the parking lot, his mind was filled with questions. Could Ethan have gone here? And if he had, what had happened to him? Inside, Richard approached the front desk. I'm looking for records on a patient who might have been here 20 years ago. His name is Ethan. He hesitated, not knowing what name the staff might have on file. Ethan Harris. The receptionist looked up at him, eyes narrowing slightly. I'm afraid I can't give you that information without permission, she said coldly. Richard's frustration grew. He leaned in closer. Please, just check. It's very important. He disappeared years ago, and I need to know what happened to him. After a tense moment, the receptionist reluctantly agreed. I'll check, but I'm only allowed to give you general information. She returned moments later with a small file. Richard's hands shook as she handed it over. Ethan Harris, the receptionist said quietly. He was admitted here for psychiatric care about 20 years ago. His records are sealed, but he was released shortly after admission. We don't know where he went after that. Richard's heart sank. Ethan had been here, but he had left, and no one knew where he had gone. Thank you, Richard muttered, his mind racing. There had to be more. He couldn't lose this trail. Not now. As he left the hospital, Richard made a decision. He would find Ethan, no matter what it took. For the next few days, Richard couldn't shake the feeling of being so close to the truth, yet still so far. The hospital record had been a dead end. Ethan had been admitted, but then what? The gap between that moment and the present seemed like a chasm he couldn't cross. He couldn't help but wonder, had Ethan been trying to escape something that was too dangerous to face alone? Determined to uncover more, Richard revisited his own home's archives. He scoured old files, looking for anything he might have missed in the years of searching. Late one evening, as he sifted through boxes in his office, a small yellowed envelope caught his eye. It was addressed to him, but it had never been opened. Inside was a letter, written in familiar handwriting. Richard's pulse quickened as he read the words, his breath catching in his throat.
Dear Father, if you're reading this, it means I've already gone. I don't know what will happen to me, but please know that I'm not running away from you. I'm running from something I can't explain. I love you, and I always will. But I can't be part of the life you want for me. Please don't search for me. It's too dangerous. I need to disappear to survive.
Richard felt the world spin. Ethan had written this letter before he vanished. But why had he left it? What was the danger that had made him feel like he had no choice but to leave everything behind? And why had it taken so long for Richard to find it? The letter gave Richard a new, deeper understanding of his son's desperation. Ethan had been trying to protect him, protect everyone. But from what? That night, Richard called Carter again. "I've found something," he said, his voice tight with emotion. A letter from Ethan. It seems like he knew something dangerous was coming for him. Something that forced him to disappear. Carter was quiet for a moment. "Do you want me to help you track down who or what might have been threatening him?" "Yes," Richard replied, his resolve firm. "We need to find out what he was running from, and we need to find him." The next day, Carter called with a lead. He had found a connection between the hospital where Ethan had stayed and a secretive group that had operated in the area at the time, an underground network involved in illegal activities. They were known for silencing people who learned too much. Richard's heart sank as he realized the magnitude of what Ethan had been trying to escape. This wasn't just a random disappearance. This was something far more sinister. Determined to get to the bottom of it, Richard set off, fueled by a mix of fear and hope. He knew that uncovering the full story would not only lead him to Ethan, but might also reveal the dangerous world his son had been forced into. And no matter where that path led, Richard would follow it to the end. Richard's journey took him to places he never imagined he'd go. Carter provided him with more information about the underground group, the one that had been operating in the shadows for decades. The group was elusive, with connections reaching into the city's most powerful circles. Their reach was so broad that few had even dared to speak its name. Richard knew this would be dangerous, but he couldn't stop now. The truth about what had happened to Ethan and what had forced him to disappear was just within his grasp. He had to know. The first stop was a small, forgotten bar on the outskirts of town. It was the kind of place where secrets were exchanged in whispers, and the scent of cheap whiskey filled the air. Carter had told Richard that this was where some of the group's former members had been spotted. Richard didn't know what he was looking for exactly, but he felt a growing sense of urgency. As he stepped inside, the noise of clinking glasses and quiet conversations seemed to fade. He scanned the room, searching for someone who might know something. Someone who might have seen Ethan. A man sitting at the back of the bar caught his eye. He was older, with a weathered face and tired eyes. His clothes were shabby, but there was something about him that made Richard approach. "Excuse me," Richard said, sitting down across from him. "I'm looking for information. I need to know about the group that operated around here years ago, the one that caused so much harm." The man glanced at him with sharp eyes, then leaned in. "You're asking about ghosts," he muttered, "and ghosts don't like to be found." Richard leaned forward, his voice low. "I'm looking for my son. His name is Ethan. He disappeared 20 years ago, and I have reason to believe he crossed paths with them. I need to know what happened to him." The man's expression softened, but only for a moment. "I don't know about your son, but I know the group. They don't leave anyone behind. They take people who know too much, people who see too much. If your son was involved, he was in deeper than you realize." Richard's heart raced. "What do you mean? Where is he?" The man hesitated, looking around the room nervously. "If he's still alive, he's somewhere they can't reach. That's the only hope you've got." "Where? Tell me where he is," Richard insisted, his voice desperate. The man shook his head. "I can't help you. They'll find me if I do. But there's one place you can check. A warehouse just outside the city. It's abandoned now, but it used to be their base of operations." Richard's pulse quickened. "Thank you," he said, standing up. He didn't hesitate, even when the man's warning echoed in his mind. The warehouse was dark and cold, the air thick with dust. As Richard stepped inside, he could almost feel the weight of the years that had passed since it had been used. It was quiet, too quiet. His footsteps echoed loudly as he moved deeper into the building, looking for any clue that could lead him to Ethan. And then he saw it, a small, hidden room at the far end of the warehouse. Inside, old files and documents were scattered across the floor, as if someone had tried to leave in a hurry. Richard knelt down and began sifting through them, his heart pounding. In one of the files, he found something that made his stomach turn. It was a photograph of Ethan, taken not long before his disappearance. The image was grainy, but it was unmistakably his son. The caption below it read, "Subject Ethan Harris, involved in classified operations, termination in progress." Richard's blood ran cold. Ethan had been caught up in something much bigger than he had imagined, something that could have cost him his life. Just then, a noise broke the silence. Footsteps, and they were coming closer. Richard quickly gathered the papers, his heart pounding in his chest. He had to leave, and fast. But just as he turned to run, a figure stepped into the doorway. It was Thomas. "Richard," Thomas said quietly, his face tense. "I've been following you. You can't keep going down this path. They'll find you too." Richard's mind raced. "Thomas, what are you doing here?" "I know who they are. I know what they did to Ethan," Thomas said, his voice low, "and I know why he disappeared. But you can't take this fight on alone. I'm with you." For a moment, Richard just stared at him, disbelief and relief mixing inside him. Thomas had been part of this all along. He had known more than he let on. "Thomas," Richard said, his voice steady but urgent, "we have to find Ethan. We have to stop this, before it's too late." Thomas nodded, stepping forward. "We will. But we have to be careful. They'll be looking for us now." Together, Richard and Thomas left the warehouse, the weight of the truth now firmly on their shoulders. But as they walked into the night, Richard couldn't shake the feeling that they were being watched. The hunt for Ethan, and the forces that had torn him from his family, was far from over.